a seat. I'm Henry Finder, an editor at the New Yorker magazine. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2011 New Yorker Festival and to a conversation with Richard Dawkins. If you're tweeting afterwards, I think the hashtag is TNYFest. If you have a camera, I think you're told not to use one, and if you have a phone, you're advised to turn it off. I think that's it for housekeeping concerns. There'll be a Q&A after the conversation, and there'll be microphones on either of the two aisles. Richard Dawkins, like mankind, has his origins in Africa. Since radiated across the planet, hunting and gathering and foraging for scientific knowledge. He was trained in zoology at Oxford, where he later taught, most recently as the Simonier Professor of the Public Understanding of Science. Richard Dawkins first achieved international renown in 1976 with a book called The Selfish Gene. And it was a book that galvanized a vast cohort of scientists because it clued them in on the implications of their own research. It was like the character in the Moliere play who says, "My God, are you saying I've been speaking prose my entire life without realizing it?" And that was the achievement of that book. It told Darwinians what it meant to be a Darwinian. And relevant to today's family inclusive event, it also helped influence more than one generation of scientists, young people who read that book and read subsequent titles in a splendid procession. The Blind Watchmaker, The Extended Genotype, Climbing Mount Improbable, and so many more. It produced so many scientists who were reached by Richard Dawkins at an early age and became just wakened to the wonders of nature. He is also the author of, more recently, of The God Delusion, which many regard as the Bible of the New Atheism. But it is difficult to think of anybody who's had a comparable impact on the public understanding of science and the role of the scientist, at least since William Whewell in the 19th century. And it was Whewell who actually coined the term scientist. So please welcome Richard Dawkins, who has redefined the term scientist for new generations. Professor Dawkins, I know that there's a question, there are many questions people have these days. What is the nature of reality? Why is there something and not nothing? Why did the new Taylor Lautner movie tank? But there's a particular question I know that has bedeviled and confounded probably everybody in this audience. And having the opportunity to have one of the finest minds in evolutionary theory address it, I think is an invitation that can't be resisted. Professor Dawkins, what did come first, the chicken or the egg?
The egg. If by that you mean the gene, there's an alternation between genotype and phenotype, where the genotype is that which goes on through countless generations and is naturally selected, and the levers of power which it presses and pulls, the puppet strings that it pulls in order to get itself into the next generation, in every generation, is the phenotype, the body, the chicken. So I'm not sure about chronologically came first, but in some sense has priority. The egg in the form of DNA could be thought of as having priority in our explanation of life.
You may have noticed that we're looking at lots of big stack of photographs. And this is actually an image taken, or a few images taken from Richard Dawkins' new book. And I wonder actually if you might explain the thought experiment behind these images.
Yes, this is from my latest book, which is being published, I think, in 3 days' time, The Magic of Reality. And what we're looking at here is a thought experiment in which the reader is invited to take a photograph of herself, an ordinary picture postcard, place it on a table, then take a photograph of her father, father's father, father's father's father, you can do it mother, whichever you like, and then go on and go on and go on, stacking these photographs into an ever higher pile. And I arbitrarily decided that the pile should stop after 185 million generations. So we've got 185 picture postcards, photographs of your ancestors stacked on top of each other. That's about 40, I think I worked out, New York skyscrapers. No, I think it's even more than that. Then I imagine tilting it on its side. And so what you're seeing there is the stack of pictures tilted on its side. And you wander along this great long bookshelf full of pictures, every now and again pulling one off. And the ones you see there are an archaic Homo sapiens and then a Homo erectus, which would have been our ancestor about 1.5 million years ago. What's interesting is that I asked the question, who was the first person? That's the title of the chapter. Every chapter in the book is a question, and every chapter in the book begins with a set of mythical answers, and then the true answer, the scientific answer. So who really was the first person? And I begin with a slightly paradoxical answer, that there never was a first person. Because every animal, every person ever born belonged to the same species as its parents. You can take that back as far as you like, and I take it back to 185 million generations ago. You turn over the page and you reveal that your 185 million great-grandfather was a fish.
Do we have a picture of a fish here?
It might even be there. And at first sight, it sounds paradoxical to say that your 185 million great-grandfather was a fish, but on the other hand, every single generation on the way back there belonged to there it is, yes, belonged to the same species as its parents and as its children. The point is, of course, that the whole process is incredibly gradual, incredibly slow. It takes millions of years. We're familiar with this kind of gradual, imperceptible change because all of us started off as a baby and became a toddler and became a child and became a teenager and became an adult. And there never was a moment when you could say, yesterday I was a toddler and now I'm a child, or yesterday I was a baby and now I'm a toddler. It doesn't happen that way. It's the same as looking at the hour hand of your watch. You can't see it move. But if you wait for an hour and look at it again, you find that it has moved. And that's like evolution. So it's a kind of fortunate accident that all the intermediates are extinct, which is why we can divide the living kingdoms into separate species which can't interbreed with each other. But if all the ancestors were still alive, then there would be a complete continuum between every creature and every other creature, going back to the common ancestor and then forward again. And as you go back, every single generation, there never was a Homo erectus parent who gave birth to a Homo sapiens baby. Always they would have been classified, if a taxonomist had been around at the time, as belonging to the same species.
How many of the species that ever were now survive?
Less than 0.1%. I mean, it's a very, very small amount. The vast majority of species that have ever lived actually went extinct before giving rise to any offspring.
And would all of these little creatures have reproduced sexually?
Sexually, do you say?
Yes.
Probably in our ancestry, yes. Mm-hmm. But there are sporadic outbreaks of asexual reproduction throughout the vertebrates. But they're not common.
As a New Yorker editor, it would be remiss if I did not ask, is sex necessary?
Well, actually, that's a very profound question. It's one of the paradoxes of evolutionary theory, because on the naive interpretation of the selfish gene theory, every animal is striving to maximize the number of its genes in the next generation. And on the face of it, a female who does away with the male sex and dispenses with the need to mate and simply clones herself is propagating 100% of her genome, whereas her rival sexual female is propagating only 50% of her genome. And so, on the face of it, asexual reproduction, if a mutant asexual reproducer were to arise, she would have a gigantic advantage in the Darwinian sense over her sexual competitors. And so any theory that anybody comes up with for what sex is good for, why sex has been favored by natural selection, has to overcome the so-called twofold cost of sex. It can't just be a very slight advantage of sexual reproduction. It's got to be a colossal advantage of sexual reproduction in order for natural selection to favor sex as opposed to asexual reproduction because of the twofold cost of sex. The twofold cost of sex only arises in those species where males are good for nothing, which is the majority.
Present company accepted.
In those species where males contribute an exactly equal share of the economic costs of rearing children, then a sexual couple can rear twice as many children as an asexual female on her own, and that wipes out the twofold cost of sex. But worthless males are so common around the animal kingdom that in the extreme case, an asexual female can rear exactly the same number of children as a sexual couple. And that's where the twofold cost of sex really bites in its extreme form.
Fascinating. So sex turns out to be much more difficult than we had even imagined.
Yes, and I mean, there are lots of evolutionary theorists working on the problem of trying to understand why sex evolved and why sex is maintained. And there are some fairly promising theories, but it's not easy. It's one of the most difficult problems in evolutionary theory.
Interesting. I wonder if we might look at the image you have of the Milky Way, because another topic that you deal with in your book is the Big Bang and the vastness of the universe, and connected with that, the question people always have of the prospects of life on other planets. There's that famous cantina scene in Star Wars that George Lucas got a lot of grief about, where different creatures from different planets all gather together at the same bar. And people say that's absurd because there's no reason to think that there would be any commonality at all between different forms of life in different worlds. What do you think? Did he get a bad break?
I'm the only person in this room who's never actually seen Star Wars. But I can guess what you mean. In any science fiction speculation, it's tempting to belabor and criticize the author for lack of imagination, because the author will tend to portray aliens from outer space as being sort of based on the familiar creatures that we know. Many of them are actually humanoid, android, but they may have great big heads and big eyes and things, or they look like octopuses, or they look like crabs, or they look like mushrooms, or something like that. And one's tempted to advance the criticism, use your imagination. Don't just make a modified mushroom or a modified lobster or something. Actually think of something really, really alien. I think it's something that evolutionary biologists can actually do to speculate. We can't, of course, know what life is like on other planets. We don't even know there is life on other planets. But we can sort of ask questions, what might we expect it to be like? And I like to phrase it as how much of what we know about life on this planet had to be true, because that's the only way for life to be, and how much of it just happens to be true on this planet. So, for example, I would conjecture, I have conjectured, I'm fairly confident of it, that however alien life elsewhere in the universe might be, it will be Darwinian life. In some sense, it'll be probably a rather different form of Darwinism, but natural selection will be the key to the evolution of life elsewhere in the universe. And that probably means that there'll be something equivalent to genes, and that something equivalent to genes will be like DNA in that it is extremely high fidelity. It looks as though you can't have natural selection without a very high-fidelity genetic system, and DNA is very high fidelity. So these are some of the general. We could ask about sex. We could say, would we expect to find sex in alien life forms? And that's much more dubious because not all life forms, even on this planet, are sexual, and we've already seen that to some extent it's rather surprising that there is sex. What about specific things like eyes? Would you expect to find eyes in alien life? Well, we know that the eye has evolved on this planet several dozen times independently. Well, that rather suggests that there's considerable pressure to evolve eyes. It didn't just happen once, like perhaps human language only evolved once, language only evolved once. Eyes have evolved dozens of times independently. Several different kinds of eyes, compound eyes, camera eyes, pinhole camera eyes, even parabolic reflector eyes, like a satellite dish. So I think it's not a bad inference to suggest that where there's light, and there probably will be light on any planet where there's life, because it's got to have a star to orbit around in order to provide the energy for life. So there's probably going to be light. And unless there's thick fog, or if it's water, thick sediment to prevent light from traveling freely in a straight line, you would expect eyes to evolve, and they'd probably be based on the same kind of principles as we know. Lenses, retinas. That seems to me to be a not improbable supposition or guess. And so a science fiction author who portrays his alien life forms as having eyes is not really showing a lack of imagination. And you might say the same thing of ears. You might say the same thing of legs, wings. What about wheels? Wheels, as far as I know, have never evolved in, well, there's one possible exception, which is the bacterium, the bacterial flagella. They rotate in a true bearing, a true axle. So this is the little whip-like, a flagellum is a little whip-like tail that many bacteria have. And it spins round and round and round and propels the bacteria along. And it really does spin in a proper free bearing. It goes round and round just like a wheel. That's probably the only good example of a wheel in having evolved naturally on this planet. Philip Pullman, in one of his children's
Golden Compass
books,
series.
Yes, he has he imagines some large sort of cow-like animals, I think they are, which have wheels, but they don't actually grow the wheels themselves. They instead they find naturally occurring, I think, plants of some kind which are wheel-shaped and use them. And there seems to be a good reason why animals don't grow wheels, because how would you get the blood supply and the nervous system out into the wheel when it's going round and round on the axle? So you can sort of make guesses as to what might or might not be true of living things on other planets. But it's probably salutary, nevertheless, to try to exercise the imagination and think of very, very weird possibilities, like a form of life that's purely gaseous rather than solid, for instance.
Nonetheless, George Lucas, vindicated.
Yeah.
I look at this image and I think of all those best-selling books on string theory. I think of Stephen Hawking's short history of the universe, and I find those books incredibly difficult when I pick them up. Do you think that and in that way it seems to me quite different from a typical book that's about the life sciences. So I wonder, just in terms of kind of scientific education, do you think that the typical reader of these books comes away with a genuine understanding of fundamental physics, or is there a barrier there?
Fundamental physics is, as you rightly say, a lot more difficult to understand. And I think you could probably make an evolutionary reason for it. I mean, what we're seeing there is galaxies, and they're receding from each other, including from us, at incredible speeds. Relativity theory means that you can't use your ordinary intuition when dealing with such matters. And similarly, when you go to the very small, when you go to quantum theory, again, the human mind is very bad at grasping quantum theory. Quantum theorists can do the mathematics, and they can derive predictions which can be tested experimentally using mathematics from assumptions which are bizarre and very, very strange indeed, very, very weird. Yet because the experimental predictions are verified to a stupefyingly high level of accuracy, out to so many decimal places, that it's equivalent to correctly predicting the width of North America to an accuracy of one human hair's breadth. That's the power of quantum theory, that it can yield predictions that accurate. And yet the assumptions that have to be made in order to deliver those accurate predictions don't seem to make sense to the average human mind. They violate common sense. Possibly as an evolutionist, I might say common sense is something built into our brains by natural selection in our evolution on the African plains, where the fastest thing you had to deal with might have been a charging buffalo or a cheetah. So you're nowhere near the speed of light when you have to start thinking in terms of relativity. And the smallest things you had to deal with might have been fleas or something, which are vastly bigger than fundamental particles. So the human brain is not equipped to have intuition, to have common sense about the very large and the very fast or the very small. We're very good at having intuitions about things that move rather slowly and are of medium size. But I often ask physicists, do you really have an intuitive grasp in your mind of quantum theory? And many times they cheerfully say, no, of course I don't. I just do the maths and test the predictions. And others even don't think it's an important question. They'll say, well, who cares whether you can do it, whether you can understand it intuitively? It works.
So the math is the real part, and the storytelling is perhaps ephemeral.
I suppose so, and you can kind of illustrate that by pointing out that quantum theory has a number of different interpretations, none of which make sense to common sense. I mean, the Copenhagen interpretation suggests that an event doesn't happen, in a sense, until you open the box and observe something. Thoroughly counterintuitive. The other major rival to that, which is the Hugh Everett theory of
worlds.
Yes, many worlds, where the world is constantly bifurcating. If you use the metaphor of Schrödinger's cat, in 50% of the universes, the cat is dead, and in 50% of the universes, the cat is still alive. The Copenhagen interpretation is that the cat is neither alive nor dead until you open the box. That's counterintuitive. And the many worlds interpretation is that the cat is both alive and dead, depending on which universe you look at. So both those things thoroughly violate common sense. And so maybe you're right. We shouldn't even try and just simply get on with the mathematics.
You heard it here. I didn't say that. So we've dealt with the life sciences. We've touched on the material sciences of physics and chemistry. What about the social sciences? Is economics a science?
Well, I don't like to pronounce them. What's this funny noise we're hearing? Somebody's singing, are they?
I think it's a combination of song and ambulance. Yeah.
Okay. It's rather fun.
It's kind of Brian Eno sound design.
I suppose, yes. I mean, I'm sure that you can treat economics and sociology in a scientific way. It's a rather different kind of science, but yes, I mean, you can build economic models which simulate the behavior of consumers and producers and people like that, in rather the same way as people simulate road traffic using models that derive directly from physics, where each car is treated as a particle. So yes, I don't see why you shouldn't treat economics as a science.
What if there are predictions that can't really be verified because in the real world, because we can't do proper experiments by building various economies as we like?
I suppose you can't do experiments. No, you have to exploit natural experiments where you look around the world and you take those countries that have such and such a property and compare it with those that have others. It's not ideal because you could have confounding variables. You're looking at correlation, which doesn't mean causation. But quite a lot of science is observational as well.
Interesting. In the on the issue of education, which I think is certainly relevant given the makeup of this audience and the focus of your new book. In America, there's a lot of emphasis on faith-based education and faith-based schooling. And I think you once proposed the idea of a non-faith-based school, a school that would be more rigorously sort of materialist in its approach.
I may have got it wrong, but I thought that in America there was a constitution in which there was a rigid separation between church and state, such that you can't have faith-based education in state schools. Isn't that right?
In state schools, yes.
But so you're talking about private
exactly.
schools, yes.
Right.
Well, in Britain, we do have faith-based education in state-supported schools, and successive governments love them. They don't seem to mind which faith it is. I mean, they support Catholic schools, Church of England schools, Muslim schools, Jewish schools. And there seems to be a sort of attitude that a child should be taught a religion, should be taught to belong to a religion. And it doesn't much matter which religion. Any religion is better than no religion. Naturally, I don't like the idea at all. And I would love not to found an atheist school, but to found a school where children are taught to think for themselves, ask questions, be critical, and don't accept anything as true unless there's evidence for it. There is, to tell a child, so and so is true because that's our tradition. Our people have always believed that, so you do too because you belong to our people. I mean, that's wicked.
Well, yes, but presumably we just talked about string theory. You could tell a child you can't possibly understand this, but there's a clever fellow named Ed Witten somewhere who is working. Well, but take it on faith for the next 25 years. No, I mean,
it's a different kind of faith. When you say take it on faith that Ed Witten understands it, you know that there is an edifice of science, that there is a practice of science. Scientific papers are refereed by experts. Scientific experiments, if they're important ones, are repeated by other experimenters all over the world. And so once something becomes accepted into the edifice of science, the standard model in the case of physics, I don't understand the details, but I do understand the process whereby science is kind of policed by peer review, by verification by other laboratories and that kind of thing. So it's an entirely different kind of faith. I wouldn't use the word faith for both.
Well, so perhaps on the individual level, I'm no different from a member of the Azandi tribe in Sudan who believes things about the witch doctors, but on the level of the society, we've worked things out so that there is ultimately a system of verification.
I don't quite understand.
Well, in other words, it may be that I take everything I know about physics on faith, and in that respect, I'm no different from someone who takes on faith the tenets of Scientology or of some traditional religion. But the difference is on a social level, on the level of the community, because this includes scientists.
I guess that's right. I mean, it's of course true that if you go and live among the Azandi or some tribe, you will find that everybody believes something, and they believe it because they're told it by the tribal elders who were told it by the tribal elders before. I think that the scientific belief is different in that the evidence is that the scientific method has been worked out in such a way that it no longer depends upon authority. You don't believe something because Ed Witten is a great physicist. You believe it because it's been through the mill of scientific, of rigorous scientific verification, etc. So I think it's really very different. Whereas in the tribal culture, you believe it because that's what the elders tell you.
Right.
But if you were to ask the elders how they know, they would say, well, the elders when I was a child told me.
So explanation runs out more swiftly in that scenario.
Yeah.
That's useful. I remember parents of my own generation were told that if children, this is much as you were saying, weren't taught some religion, they would all go off and join the Hare Krishna or possibly the Munis, and so it was better to sort of introduce them to something. Now you've since had a daughter of your own, and did she join the Hare Krishnas?
I think the threat of joining the Hare Krishnas or the Munis or something. I mean, they're no worse than the Christians or the Muslims. I mean, they're just. I mean, the Munis are just a more recent cult. So that's not the threat I'm familiar with. The threat I'm familiar with is that if you don't bring your child up in a religion of some sort, she'll go out and rob and kill and steal and behave in an anarchic way. I think if she joined the Hare Krishnas, she'd probably be a rather nice, peaceful sort of person. But I wouldn't be happy with either, because I would want any child of mine to be critical and to think for herself, and to, as I said before, abide by evidence.
One element that religion provides in every society is some sense of moral guidance, but of course you don't need religion for that. And a question that comes up a lot recently is, can we, from the study of nature, and maybe we can look at devils now, can we, from the study of nature, elicit some kind of moral guidance? Can we get a rational moral philosophy that might be based on observable facts? Did morality itself evolve?
Yes, I mean we can certainly ask questions about where our moral sense comes from, and we can look for evolutionary precursors of a modern, sophisticated moral sense. If you look at our moral sense, the thing that strikes me about it is how rapidly it changes in historical time. So you don't have to go back very far until you come to more or less universal acceptance of the rightness of slavery, except among the slaves themselves, of course. And nowadays, nobody would give time to anybody who advocates slavery. Racial prejudice, in my lifetime, in England at least, and I suspect here, people of my grandparents' generation in England were virtually all racist. I mean, virtually without exception. And they wouldn't have been, they wouldn't have advocated cruelty to other races, but they certainly were paternalistic, patronizing, condescending, treating other races as though they were like children. When I was a child in Africa, in British colonial Africa, the all-African men were called boys. And I think that was probably true in the southern states of America in the time of slavery. This is a patronizing and nowadays we would say immoral attitude, and it's changed. And the great majority of people now either don't do that or are ashamed if they do, or keep quiet about it if that's what they feel. So this is a dramatic change in the moral zeitgeist that has taken place in Europe and in America within living memory. And that's come about, nothing to do with religion, it's come about through a secular discussion, through conversation, through journalism, through parliamentary discussion, through court cases. It's a very, very striking process. You see it also in warfare. If you look at the recent wars that we've been involved in, say in Iraq, horrible as they are, there is widespread recognition that civilian casualties are extremely unfortunate and to be avoided. And so whenever in the Iraq war an American or Allied plane caused civilian casualties. This was a matter for great regret, great heart-searching, quite rightly so. Even Donald Rumsfeld was prepared to regret, in some token sense, civilian casualties. If you go back to the Second World War, which is not that long ago, civilian casualties are what it was all about. Massive carpet bombing of Dresden, of Coventry, of Hiroshima, of Bristol. This was part of what you did in war. And nowadays, that is completely unacceptable. Once again, we've got a shift in the moral zeitgeist, nothing to do with religion. It's something, it may be even rather mysterious what it's due to, but something is changing. Something is in the air that's changing us and making us, I think, better, more decent, more moral. Moral philosophers chart this and, to some extent, try to prescribe it, and I think it doesn't. I think it owes very little to religion.
Mm-hmm. But separate from that, is it something that you could elicit from the study of nature? Can you look at, I don't know, the conditions of human flourishing and arrive at certain tenets of behavior from that? Is there some way of naturalizing morality?
Well, yes. I mean,
and you have an ought from it is.
Sam Harris has written a recent book on this. I forget. It's called The Moral Landscape. That's right. In which he takes the rather radical step of saying, for all our lives we've said science has nothing to do with what's moral. Science has to do with what's true about the world, but moral questions are nothing to do with science. And almost all scientists will say that. Sam Harris sort of wants to depart from that and to sort of say that at very least science can tell you what, if you just accept one or two very, very basic moral principles, like suffering is bad or something like that, and then science can tell you much more than intuition can how to avoid suffering. Mm-hmm. And so that's a very interesting book, The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris. Another very interesting book that I haven't yet got, it's not yet published, is Steven Pinker's new book. Do you happen to know what that's called? It's something about angels.
The better angels of our being.
Yes. And I'm really looking forward to getting hold of that book, because I believe what he's saying is that if you look historically, killing by humans is historically getting less and less if you divide by the total, killings per person. And the chance of being murdered in our ancestral times was hugely greater, even than the 20th century, where you have these horrible...
So continuing that extrapolation, what practices that we take for granted today do you think we'll look back on with horror in the future?
Well, if we look back 200 years, we've got slavery, where half the human race was regarded by the other half as being fit only for bondage and slavery, were owned by masters, and they could do whatever they liked with them. Is there a parallel today? Well, I suppose there might be some people who would say, what about other species? After all, in the time of slavery, people pretty much believed that races were so different that you could treat them as being inferior. And nowadays we do that to other species. If you take evolution to its logical conclusion, we're all cousins. As I said earlier, it's just an accident that the intermediates between us happen to be dead. And I once invented a thought experiment whereby you stand in Africa on the shores of the Indian Ocean and you hold out your hand and hold the hand of your mother. And she holds the hand of her mother. It's rather similar to my postcard, actually. She holds the hand of her mother, and so on. And this line of females holding each other's hand, generation after generation, before generation, before generation, before generation, until you hit the common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees, who lived about 6 million years ago, as we now know from molecular evidence. And then the common ancestor, she's holding her one daughter, who is the ancestor of all humans, in this hand. She's holding another daughter, who is the ancestor of all humans, in this hand. There had to be such an individual. And all the intermediates are there, opposite their cousins. So here they're opposite their first cousins, their second cousins, third cousins. It's an oversimplification. Fourth cousins, fifth cousins, down to us today facing chimpanzees, who are our umpteenth cousins. If the intermediates were all still alive, then we could say that there is a continuous line of interbreeding possibility. This one can mate with this one, who can mate with this one, who can mate with this one, who can mate with this one, etc. This one can't mate with this one, but there's a chain of intermediates connecting them, such that they could all interbreed with their neighbors in the chain. So it would be quite impossible to draw a line around humans and say, okay, this lot are humans, that lot aren't. Couldn't be done. The only way you could do it would be to do something ridiculous, like they did in South Africa in apartheid times, when there were laws that said that white people could do so-and-so and black people couldn't. And they actually had courts to decide whether people who were of intermediate race counted as white. They actually had courts where people went up and tried to argue the case that they should be regarded as white because they were mostly white. You'd have to do something like that if you wanted to formulate laws, morals, ethics that were human-based, and which is exactly what we have. I mean, you can kill a chimpanzee if you own the chimpanzee because it's becoming a nuisance. But if you kill a human, it's murder. And it's easy to do that now because all the intermediates happen to be extinct. Mm-hmm. But that is an accident. It might not have been true. It might yet be true that there are intermediates surviving somewhere in the African jungle. It's very unlikely. Mm-hmm. But suppose it happened, then that would immediately necessitate a complete change in all our laws and our ethics. Mm-hmm. And surely laws and ethics cannot be treated as absolute if they depend upon the mere accident of intermediates just happening to be extinct. So even though it's a thought experiment that should make us pause, make us wonder whether in 200 years' time our descendants may look back on the way we treat chimpanzees with as much horror as we look back on the way our ancestors treated slaves.
So you're arguing even that apes should have rights?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I just think it's a very difficult question. Mm-hmm. It happens to be a fortunate, from one point of view, fact that the intermediates are extinct, which means that it actually is practicable to make laws about one species rather than another, simply because there is a natural discontinuity. So I think maybe it's okay to do that. I mean, I think one could defend a morality and a system of law that's based upon the existence of that discontinuity. But what you cannot do is to say that the discontinuity has some absolute fundamental significance. Mm-hmm. You can't do that. The most you can do is to say it's a matter of practical convenience that there are gaps in the animal kingdom such that it is possible definitely to decide whether an individual is human or chimpanzee. There are no intermediates. There's not a problem. But that's just an accident. Mm-hmm. And anybody who bases their human-centered morality on an assumption of absolutism is, I think, talking nonsense. And so the way in which our moralists in our society treat a single or a four-celled human embryo as having more rights than an adult chimpanzee, and they can only do that by the absolutist criterion that these 4 cells are human, whereas this great, big, sentient, emotional, behaving being is not human. That kind of absolutist distinction, which values a 4-celled embryo over an adult chimpanzee, is utter nonsense.
So we have a research project for future moral theorists in our midst. I wonder if you have advice for young scientists. I'm sure some people here on the younger side will end up making those contributions. I mean, for example, what are the sort of cool areas of research right now? Where would you encourage people to look into?
Well, I'm a biologist. I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I do think that that's exceptionally thrilling. Molecular genetics is now burgeoning to a quite extraordinary extent. What happened in 1953 when Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA, and the molecular biologists who followed them deciphered the genetic code, and we started to realize that the basis of life is digital information technology. Genetics is just a branch of information technology. A chromosome is just like a computer tape. It's digital. Every bit of information is an all or none thing. That is an astounding fact. With hindsight, one might almost say that it had to be that way, or natural selection couldn't have worked, as I said earlier. Nevertheless, it's something that Darwin and his contemporaries couldn't have dreamed of. And it has the consequence that every living creature carries around inside its cells coded information written in exactly the same machine code as every other individual animal, plant, fungus, bacterium in the world. Nobody could have guessed that. It means that you can compare any pair of organisms you like, doesn't matter how distant they are, how close they are, and you can use, literally you count the number of discrepancies in the digital codes of particular genes which you can identify as being clearly the same gene in all creatures. You literally count the number of discrepancies between them, and you can read off from that how long ago their common ancestor lived, making various assumptions which are quite tricky, and there's quite a lot of error involved. But in principle, you can work out the complete family tree of all life. The complete family tree, you could literally draw it out, and the biologists of the future should be able to do that, and work out how long ago each branch point occurred. What a staggering thing to be able to approach for young scientists of the future. In physics, in Britain at least, there's a dearth of young people coming forward to study physics. And that seems to me to be an enormous shame. I don't know if it's true here. It's an enormous shame because physics could very well be on the brink of amazing leaps forward. The Large Hadron Collider in Geneva. Shall I tell my Large Hadron Collider story?
Go right ahead.
Some people have probably heard it before. In one of my books, I think it was The Greatest Show on Earth, I was waxing what I was trying to be poetic about modern physics and the Large Hadron Collider, and how moved I was when I went to visit the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva. And I was almost moved to tears by the beauty of this human enterprise, cooperative human enterprise. And as I was proofreading, I came across the Large Hard-On Collider. And I, of course, left it in. The publisher's proofreader, unfortunately, also spotted it and removed it, and I begged her to put it back, but she said it was more than her job was worth. But I genuinely do find this huge complex of experimental physics very, very moving. And I was literally almost moved to tears by it because it's a multinational enterprise. You hear people talking all sorts of different languages. It's a gigantic underground tunnel. I think it's 26 miles in diameter or something like that. Physics could be on the verge of tremendous breakthroughs. And so this could be a wonderful time for a young person to go into physics. And unfortunately, not many of them are, possibly because it's just difficult. Maybe they're just lazy. That's one speculation I've heard.
So the Large Hadron Collider, which is just pulsating with energy and on the verge of thrusting into new fields of physical knowledge. Yeah, I can certainly see the importance of that area. But I think of your own doctoral work, which is on baby chicks and decision making, and it turns out, from my experience, that animal decision making is itself a rather hot subject. There's Christian List at LSE, and there's Seeley at Cornell, and so on. And it occurred to me, given your work on the decision-making process among baby chicks, you would be the best qualified person in the world to answer the second cone that bedevils all of us, and that is, why did the chicken cross the road? Which is to say, can we impute beliefs, desires, and intentions to lower vertebrate, to bird-brained creatures?
Yes, I mean, I suppose any animal can be said to make a decision when it does something when it could have done something else. And so worms make decisions. Has my mic gone off? Okay. Worms make decisions in a sense, and chickens certainly could be said to make decisions. It's a separate question whether they are conscious of them. I rather doubt whether worms are, but it's a very deep question what consciousness is. I suppose each of us only really knows that we are, as individuals, conscious. We know that it would be possible to design a computing machine which behaved in ways that sort of mimicked a conscious being, and we don't know that it would have to be conscious. It could be that I'm the only conscious being in the world, and all the rest of you are just part of my dream or something of that sort. That's known as solipsism, isn't it?
It would explain a lot, though.
Yeah. There's a lovely story that Bertrand Russell told, that he once got a letter from a woman who said, "Dear Lord Russell, I'm so pleased to hear that you're a solipsist too. There are so few of us around these days." But I didn't really answer the question, did I? I mean, I think it's an unanswerable question at the moment.
It's the sort of do you think dogs have consciousness? I suppose we could start there.
The reason I think you have consciousness is that I know I do, and you're pretty much like me. And
Thank you.
That's the same. Everyone is pretty much like each other. My intuitive feeling is that's the same with dogs. But it's not. It doesn't really go much better than that, because behavioral tests. A skeptic, a killjoy, can always come up with a mechanistic explanation which they would say excludes consciousness. But yet we have to, as biologists, we have to explain how consciousness arose in evolution. It clearly did. We are conscious, or I am anyway, and I think you are too. And this must have arisen in evolution. So it's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. When did it arise in evolution? Did it suddenly burst forth? I doubt it. Or did it gradually increase? Are worms just a tiny little bit conscious? And dogs very much conscious, and we even more? These are questions that I don't feel qualified to answer, but I think that they need thinking about.
We have an image here of the classic Galenic humors, which were meant to explain the workings of the human soul and mind. And a controversial branch of evolutionary biology these days is evolutionary psychology, which tries to explain human behavior and human tendencies in ways that are compatible with evolution. Do you find, say, in your marriage, evolutionary psychology to be something that?
Well, it's a branch of psychology which takes evolution seriously and tries to interpret the impulses, the desires, the passions, the loves, the hates that we have in terms of how they must have evolved in what's called the environment of evolutionary EEI. I've forgotten what they call it. When it was necessary to survive, you had to hunt, you had to have sex, you had to rear children, you had to find a good place to live, and all the sorts of things that psychological predispositions that would have been necessary in order to survive and reproduce in Africa in the Pleistocene. And I think it's quite a fruitful way of proceeding. You have to be quite sophisticated about it. And evolutionary psychology is a much vilified branch of psychology among social scientists. They don't like it. And I suppose some evolutionary psychologists do overstep the mark a bit, but I think it is broadly a worthwhile discipline. I approve of it. And that would be another interesting subject, by the way, for young people to go into.
Mm-hmm. Good. What is your biggest worry when it comes to human survival? 50 years from now.
Martin Rees, the present Astronomer Royal and former president of the Royal Society, has written a book in which he gives the human race a 50-50 chance of surviving this century. And his main worry is that technology provides methods of mass destruction which have hitherto been disciplined by being the preserve of governments where you need lots of money and lots of resources and lots of clever scientists and technologists and engineers in order to build them. And his worry is that the means of making these things is becoming cheaper and cheaper and easier. And so there will come a time in his foreboding when Al-Qaeda or some equivalent, some religious maniac, could lay hands on, if not a physical weapon like a hydrogen bomb, a biological weapon, some plague which could exterminate all living things. Usually you can rely on people's desire for self-preservation to forestall that. But if you've got people who believe that they actually want to die because they believe they're going to go to paradise if they die a martyr's death, and there are such people, as Sam Harris says, what you have to remember is these people really believe what they say they believe. And he's talking about militant Muslims. If there are people who actively want to die in the process of becoming a martyr, then if such a person got his hands on a weapon of mass destruction, the normal deterrent against using it would not be there.
There are people who worry about the threat posed by your fellow biologists and molecular geneticists. They worry about genetically modified food, they worry about cloning, they worry about the frontiers of science. How should that kind of activity be regulated?
The precautionary principle does seem to me to be wise. If you don't know the outcome of something, then you'd be wise to think very hard before you do it. And so I think we need to be responsible about it. On the other hand, if we applied the precautionary principle too rigidly, we'd never have developed the steam engine and all the other things which are a blessing. So I think you need to be cautious, but not hysterical.
Mm-hmm. Is an example of something, which prompted the thought, of something that you used to believe but no longer believe, something in science, maybe something that you were inclined to think was true, came to realize was not?
I can think of something that I used to think was false that I now think is true.
That works too.
The so-called handicap principle in my own field of animal behavior. Sexual selection produces sometimes gorgeously extravagant advertisements, and the proverbial one is the peacock's tail. And Darwin wondered about how the peacock's tail evolved. It clearly was a handicap. It clearly is a handicap. It makes it much easier for predators to catch a peacock that's got this great weight of the fan. And Darwin explained it by sexual selection, saying that peahens like it. And so once you accept that, then those peacocks who develop a huge, great, beautiful tail have the most offspring, and so pass on the genes. Darwin wouldn't have used the word genes. Their sons would have inherited the same thing. In Darwin's view, the peacock's tail was favored because females liked it, in spite of the fact that it was a handicap. In the 1970s, an Israeli biologist called Amos Zahavi suggested that things like peacock's tails evolve not in spite of being a handicap, but because they are a handicap. And his idea is a very radical one, which I thought was absurd when I first read it, that a male who has a handicap is advertising what a superior male he must be, because how otherwise could he have survived with this great handicap on his back? And Zahavi delights in human analogies, and he has the analogy of two men running a race and women watching the race to see who impresses them. And they come in as a dead heat, exactly equal speed, but one of the men is carrying a sack of coal and the other man isn't. And so the woman chooses the one who was carrying a sack of coal because he obviously is really the faster runner. And I and many other people thought this was an absurd idea when translated into biology, because although as long as the chap can throw off his sack of coal, he then really is a faster runner. In nature, they don't throw off the sack of coal. The peacock's tail is still there. And so the handicap would seem to be sort of self-defeating. And I ridiculed the handicap theory in the first edition of The Selfish Gene, and my revered colleague, the late John Maynard Smith, ridiculed it as well. Or not exactly ridiculed it, but built mathematical models that showed that it was very unlikely. My former student and now colleague, Alan Graffan, much later, very, very cleverly devised a mathematical model which showed that the handicap principle really does work. And this was mind-blowing to me. And it really does change the way you look at animal behavior, because almost anything you look at, if you look at it through the eyes of Amos Zahavi, you can see it as a handicap, being favored because it's a handicap. He uses human analogies like men buying an incredibly expensive engagement ring, which utterly impoverishes them to impress a woman. And that kind of thing. But because it's a handicap, the more of a handicap it is, the more impressive it is. The extreme case in human culture is the so-called potlatch ceremonies of I think it's the northwest of North America, where tribes compete with each other for who can give the most lavish gifts. And the competition escalates to the point where they literally do go bust, because they're so eager to compete with giving and showing off how rich they really must be, because they can afford to give away so much, and actually they ruin themselves by doing so. That's the potlatch system, which is a kind of that's long been known about, and that was one of the sort of inspirations for Zahavi.
On the theme of self-display, I think we can start queuing up if people have questions. On the other side, they'll move the microphones in place. In the meantime, maybe I'll just toss you an easy one. multi-level selection seems to be among some people a bit of a return. E.O. Wilson. How should we think about these new developments?
Well, that's not a simple question. That requires a lot of background. I could simply say I'm against it.
Okay.
I think that it is a semantic trick to redefine what we had for years called kin selection, redefine it as group selection, which it is not, or it's misleading to call it group selection. I have no time at all for the attempted revival of group selection theory. I think it's retrograde and is muddying the waters, which we had for many years struggled to clarify and succeeded in clarifying, and it is just simply muddying the waters again.
The selfish gene lives on.
Yes.
Would you like to ask?
Hi, thank you so much for your time today and for being here. I've been contemplating as you've been speaking. In college, I read a book by Elaine Scarry called The Body in Pain. And to simplify her last chapter, she says the seminar was on suffering. And so that the human, as a testament to the human condition, with gravity, we have chairs. To deal with the elements, we build homes and we have roofs. And to deal with suffering, we create religion and God to explain things. So using the metaphor of the selfish gene and in referencing evolutionary psychology, in passing down religion to our children, is it an element of surviving this? And when will we, based on reason and logic, when will religion not be necessary? Do you see that happening? And again, if we just have 100 years, we might not. This might not be relevant. But do you ever see a time where we look back and whatever?
I mean, if you're suggesting that religion is a remedy for suffering, that it's a sort of consolation that people resort to when they're suffering, that's quite plausible. And if you look around the world at where religion has taken most hold and still has a hold, it tends to be in places where there's great poverty, where there's great suffering, and where there's very little in the way of security, very little in the way of government taking care of people in the form of healthcare, that kind of thing. So that does seem to me to be plausible. It's even true, actually, if you look within the United States, as has been shown by Gregory Paul, who compares the different states of the Union and shows that there is a correlation between religiosity and the sort of negative indices of public welfare. So things like abortion, short lifespan, that kind of thing tends to be at its maximum in those states which are most religious. So Gregory Paul's work is interesting. So I suppose the answer to your question would be, yes, we could look forward to a future without religion if we can also look forward to a future of greater prosperity and greater health and greater happiness.
Thanks so much. Quick question and comment. I would just say for social science that experiments can be done. And there are many, many experiments done in sociology and psychology looking at incentives and things that can predict people's behavior. The question, though, is in the God delusion, some people have criticized the notion that implicitly the absence of evidence is evidence of absence, so to speak, that just because we don't know something about God or something beyond that means that we have to stick with what we know. But of course, there may be many things that we don't know just because we don't know them, limitations of the human brain. I'm just wondering how you would respond to that.
Well, I think there's so many things that we don't know, and there are so many possibilities that we could, with free imagination, invent, that we do need a sort of discipline. It's no good saying because you can't disprove the existence of unicorns or ghosts or Baal or Thor, Therefore, we should regard the existence of Thor and Baal and unicorns as being kind of on a par with their non-existence. If you want to postulate something, since there's an infinite number of wacky things you could postulate if you wanted to, the onus is on somebody who wishes to believe something to find some positive evidence that it's there. I can't see why one would say, just because I can't disprove the existence of X, therefore I'm going to believe in X. And you could say, therefore I'm going to keep an open mind about X, but then we keep an open mind about fairies and hobgoblins and ghosts and all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Maybe on the left?
Yes, the selfish gene, you talked about, you know, how we can rise above our selfish genes. And the example you give is when we use contraception. And I just think to myself, well, the end result is different if contraception is used. There's no baby. But is that really rising above selfish gene if the program that's programmed into our brain is still being executed?
Well, the point about the contraception analogy is that I wanted to make the case that we can rebel, I use the word rebel, against the dictates of the selfish gene. And the reason why we might want to do that is that we might wish to say, well, selfish genes might, if we follow them blindly, might lead us to a society, the sort of society we wouldn't want to live in, sort of society where a sort of dog eats dog, a kind of Margaret Thatcher society. There have been people who have said, how can you possibly talk about rebelling against the selfish gene? And so I used contraception as just an example of that clearly contraception is not something that would be favored by natural selection. Contraception is an anti-Darwinian invention, but it's easy to understand in Darwinian terms because in nature, where there isn't any contraception, it's sufficient that we enjoy sex because children tend to follow sex if you don't use contraception. And what's built into our brains is a rule of thumb that says, built in by our genes into our brains is a rule of thumb that says enjoy sex. And that rule of thumb works. And that rule of thumb is still there even when we have contraception. And similarly, a rule of thumb, you can imagine any sort of rule of thumb that doesn't have a kind of far-seeing cognitive link to what's good for the genes, but is a rule of thumb which under normal conditions will have the effect of preserving the selfish genes. And then that plays itself out in very different ways in our very, very different society.
May I ask another? Or is
Well,
it
there's rather a large line.
okay. All right, thank you.
To the right. Thank you.
I apologize for what this question reveals about my knowledge of evolutionary biology, but you seem like a handy guy to ask. You were talking about vision earlier, and I've been, really disappointed in standard human vision, at least for, a good percentage of the population. There's a need for corrective lenses. In terms of things just out of the box not working, I wondered if you could speak to that, and how many generations down I could expect, my great-great-grandchildren to either not need them or need the cyborg eyes.
It's a Mac guy.
I mean, there are two ways of answering this. One quite interesting way is that there are flaws in all animal bodies which result from the fact that there's a historical legacy. So in the case of the eye, most people know that the retina is back to front, that the retina has the, instead of having the photocells, so to speak, facing the world, as they do in octopus eyes, in vertebrate eyes, the photocells face backwards. And the wires connecting the photocells to the brain have to run over the surface of the retina and then plunge through where the optic nerve goes in the so-called blind spot. This is clearly bad design. There's no question about it. I mean, any engineer would simply send it back. And it results from history, from the fact that in history the eye evolved from a certain embryological process, which meant that it was an invagination, an exvagination of the brain, which determined the way it is. In octopus ancestry, it was different. It developed in a different way, and so the octopus eye has the photocells facing in the right direction. The recurrent laryngeal nerve is my favorite example. This is a nerve which runs from the brain. It's one of the cranial nerves, and it runs to the larynx. That's its end organ. But instead of going straight to the larynx, it goes down into the chest, loops its way around one of the main arteries in the chest, and then goes straight back up again to the larynx. In a giraffe, that is a detour of about 15 feet. And I've actually taken part in a dissection of a giraffe's neck to verify that it actually does that, and it does. Well, again, it's historical accident. If you look back to our fish ancestors, then the equivalent of that nerve, the shortest distance from the brain to what was then the equivalent of the larynx, was indeed south of the aorta, south of the artery that we're talking about. But then in evolution, when land vertebrates got gradually longer and longer necks, and fish don't have necks, in mammals, say, where the neck got longer and longer and longer, the marginal cost of a very slight increase in the length of the detour compared to the previous generation was very, very slight compared to the marginal cost of a radical change in embryology which would have been necessary in order to jump the nerve to the other side of the artery. Those are just two examples of imperfections which come about through historical accident. Another one would be the back pain that so many humans suffer from, resulting from the fact that we've only rather recently risen up on our hind legs from walking on all fours. But the reason why so many people have defective vision and need glasses to correct them is probably just an aspect of general variation. People vary, genetically vary, and vary in other ways. And also aging. Most people need glasses when they get past a certain age. And I had very good vision when I was younger. And then when I got into my late 40s, I started to need slight corrective lenses, and then they became stronger. And most people have that experience. In nature, without glasses, we would have been at a very severe disadvantage. I mean, it really would have been difficult. And no doubt many of our ancestral, well, friends of our ancestors anyway, and our ancestors actually, died as a result of being increasingly long-sighted as they got older. But of course, the older you are, when the defect hits you, the more likely you are to have had your children already. And so any defect which shows itself relatively late in life has a great chance of being passed on to the next generation before it expresses itself. And so the older you are, the more it simply doesn't matter from an evolutionary point of view. The genes get through the filter because those individuals suffering from the defect have already done their reproducing.
So you don't think it will?
I don't see why it should. No. On the contrary. No.
You have been working on the public understanding of science, or better understanding of science. Aren't you a bit frustrated that it seems that there is more need for this understanding every day, every week, every year, and less actual understanding among our politicians, among so many people who make public policy and so on? Do you have any ideas, do you have any prescriptions for how we're going to get beyond this problem of the lack of scientific knowledge among the general public?
I believe it's true that in Britain, 19% of the population think it takes 1 month for the Earth to orbit the Sun. And 27% of the population think that humans coexisted with dinosaurs. And I would expect that the figure would not be that different. In fact, I know it's not that different in most European countries. These are very sad facts because the real world, the magic of reality, is so magical, and it's such a terrible deprivation that people go through life earning their living, successfully driving a car and successfully filling in their income tax forms and things, while having not the slightest clue about what is known of the world and the universe in which they live, and this fascinating world of truth that is out there. The problem is compounded in those cases where politicians, even politicians running for supremely high office, have an utterly cockeyed view of reality, which they either really hold, or, which is almost worse, correctly believe that it's to their electoral advantage to pretend they hold, on the grounds that the electorate, large swathes of the electorate, actively mistrust intelligence, education, and knowledge, which I believe may be the case in large parts of the Republican Party. And I mean, it could be regarded as a sort of inherent weakness of the democratic system, and as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst system ever devised, except for anything else anybody's ever thought of.
Is there anything we can do about the situation?
Well, I wish I knew, and maybe people have got suggestions. It doesn't seem to work just to talk sense, especially if you're seen as one of those pointy-headed intellectuals back east.
Hello. Along with your focus on the public understanding of science, I'm wondering if you could just share a couple thoughts about the implications of this new information about a particle being shown to be faster than the speed of light.
I'm not a physicist, but I read the papers like anybody else, and my understanding is that this experiment, which took place in Geneva, well, the particles were, the neutrinos were released in Geneva by the Large Hadron Collider, and by some means which I don't understand, they were timed reaching a sensitive barrier in Italy, and which is far enough away that there was allegedly enough distance for the difference in speed to be measured, and they measured it at a tiny bit faster than light. When you get an experimental finding which contradicts the edifice of existing physics, then you have a choice. Either you suspect that the observation is mistaken, or was a lie, or was just some kind of error in measurement, and you repeat the experiment, and other people repeat the experiment, and you go on hammering away at it until you're satisfied that it's really true. And if you're satisfied that it's really true, then you have this agonizing decision to overthrow one of the central planks of physics. And I understand, understand's too strong a word, I hear that Einstein's theory of special relativity would either have to be abandoned or would have to admit the possibility of going backwards in time. So if you stick with Einstein, you admit the possibility of going backwards in time, or you reject Einstein. But probably the best thing at the moment is to wait until it's been verified and re-verified, and perhaps re-verified again.
Would you connect that to human miracles?
Well, human miracles would be very germane here, because Hume would say, which would be the greater miracle well, it's not quite like human miracles, a bit more Hume on Einstein. Which would be the greater miracle, that Einstein would be wrong, or that somebody's made a mistake in their measurements? And if it's not that miraculous to imagine that somebody could have been mistaken in their measurements, it does happen, then you opt for the least miraculous explanation.
Hello. I really appreciated the metaphor of the pictures that you had stacked earlier in the talk. And it makes me curious because so much of the discussion about evolution is about where we've come from. But I'm interested to know where in your imagination you think we're going. So where will we be in 10,000, a million, however long we manage to survive? How do you imagine us looking, feeling, acting in the future?
That is, without exception, the commonest question I ever asked. So I've got fairly used to answering it. I suppose that the first thing to say is that 10,000 years, you wouldn't notice any change anyway. In a million years, if you look back, you would notice, you notice a change. Homo erectus is noticeably different from us. If you go back 3 million years, you've got a chimpanzee brain perched on top of a two-legged animal. And so you might speculate that in 3 million years in the future, that trend in evolution might have continued. And just as the brain has swelled up like a balloon, swollen like a balloon in the last 3 million years, maybe it will be as big again in 3 million years' time. In order for that to be true, it would be necessary that the biggest brained individuals have the most children. No doubt there must have been some selection pressure to make the brain grow bigger from 3 million years ago in the time of Australopithecus to now. And probably it's reasonable to think that indeed there would have had to be genetic variation in braininess, which was favored, and there are various theories for why braininess was favored. It doesn't seem very likely that braininess is being favored at the moment in terms of reproductive success. So probably you wouldn't expect to see a continuation, an extrapolation of the trend in brain size that we had before. Actually, you might not expect any major trend, because in the sort of society we have at the moment, where undoubtedly some people have more children than others, but in order for any evolutionary trend to give rise to, for any selection pressure to give rise to an evolutionary trend, it's necessary for that selection pressure to be sustained for a large number of generations. So let's think about what kind of selection pressure might be going on at the moment. There must be quite a lot of people who are born purely because their parents bungled a contraceptive technique. So many of us owe our existence to our parents' fumbling ineptitude. If there is a genetic component to fumbling ineptitude, either in general or in handling particular devices, then you might say that in principle there is a natural selection pressure in favor of it. And you might expect that if you come back in many generations' time, you'll find an entire population of bunglers. But that isn't really plausible, because the speed with which things change in a cultural environment, the speed with which, in this particular case of this example, contraceptive techniques change, would be so great that it's unlikely that any one selection pressure would be sustained for long enough to cause an evolutionary trend. Wherever there's something that kills people young, if there's a disease that kills people in childhood, then any genetic tendency to get that disease is clearly going to be selected against. But that's a rather special case, probably.
Assuming that we do survive the next 100 years, can you comment on recent anti-aging research and the increasing length of the lifespan of human beings and how that may affect dwindling resources in our world?
Yes. Medical science already, of course, has increased lifespan considerably. Not maximum lifespan so much, but average lifespan. And if that continues in the direction that some people have speculated, then it would have radical consequences, and at very least, one might have to think in terms of radically reducing birth rates in order to compensate for decreasing death rates. But it also would change the age structure. If it would be one thing if the increased lifespan left us looking and behaving and having the attributes of younger people into our hundreds, then that would be rather different. But if what we're talking about is a population of geriatric dodderers, then it becomes a very serious problem of how the younger people are going to have to look after them.
I think we might have time for one last question.
Professor Dawkins, you talked about the edifice of science and the policing structure of rigorous peer review that distinguishes itself from religion, which you take largely on faith. My question is, do you see threats to that policing structure, things that compromise it? Brian Goldacre, who is this physician and British epidemiologist who's written extensively on battling bad science, bemoans the fact that in medical science at least, he cites the example of Big Pharma sponsoring clinical trials and withholding results of a whole slew of trials. And so it's not to cast aspersion on every clinical trial that's conducted by Big Pharma, but when you don't see the entire story, you're distorting the results that ensue. What do you see as the biggest threats to this peer reviewing structure?
Yes.
And with the chinks in the armor?
That's a very shrewd point. It's Ben Goldacre, actually, not yes, yeah.
Did I say
yeah. Well, scientists are human, and there are dishonest scientists as well as dishonest everything else. And unfortunately, it seems to be, especially in medical science, I'm not quite sure why, but there are quite a lot of attested cases of actual fraud in medical research, of people who are ambitious and want to get ahead, and so make up their results. That's a very utterly reprehensible thing. I mean, if that became common in science, it would completely undermine the whole scientific enterprise. The really big findings, things which really have a dramatic impact on the scientific edifice, as we have both called it, those sorts of experiments get repeated, and they get repeated in slightly different ways in different parts of the world. The cold fusion results that were reported some years ago, which would, if verified, have been had a very dramatic impact upon all of physics and technology. Those experiments were repeated. They didn't hold up. It's no longer taken seriously. The problem comes with scientific findings which are not sort of important enough for people to bother to repeat them. And I guess that may be part of the problem with biological research, where there's just so much you can work on in biology that it's hard to expect that every experiment will ever be repeated. And so there must be quite a few reported experiments which are not actually valid. But the ones that really matter tend to get repeated.
Actually, let's hear from a younger generation.
Okay, good point.
I was just wondering, because I had a question. I noticed it's kind of like a standoff between religion and science. Do you think there will be a particular winner? Like, one example was a while ago, my cousin and I got into a big argument because I'm a skeptic and she's a Christian, so we got into a huge argument. And I couldn't prove her wrong because there wasn't any evidence that God wasn't real. That's the point. There's no evidence at all. So, and she couldn't prove me wrong because of the same thing. So it was kind of a standoff. Samantha's unfortunately really good at arguments. She loves to pick up her ideas and beat us up with them. So...
Any tips?
Yes, well, That's yeah. Thank you. That's sort of a bit like a previous question we had. What you could say to her is something like, well, you can't disprove the existence of Mother Goose. You can't disprove the Easter Bunny. You can't disprove fairies. But you don't waste your time believing in the Easter Bunny, or maybe she does, or fairies, or indeed Santa Claus. Since there's an infinite number of things which you can say you can't disprove, you need to exercise a sort of mental discipline and saying, at least there should be some indication that something exists before you believe it. Would that be a possible thing to try out on her, do you think?
What?
Could you give that a try?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, report back. Thank you very much for the question,
You're welcome.
and thank you all for coming.